Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 8 of Pakistan Studies. The topic that we are going to discuss today is ALLAMA IQBAL'S presidential address of December 1930. All India Muslim League held its annual session at Allahabad on 29th and 30th of December 1930. ALLAMA IQBAL presided that session and gave his presidential address. We are going to discuss that address. ALLAMA IQBAL'S address is also described as the Allahabad address because the session of the Muslim League was held at Allahabad. Today's presentation will be divided into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about the background. Second, the presidential address. What did he say in that address? Third, we'll talk about the importance of this address in Indian history. ALLAMA IQBAL ranks amongst the intellectuals who had deep impact on history. He inspired Muslims in Indo-Pakistan subcontinent and elsewhere, Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, where Muslims were inspired by his poetry, by his writings. He was moving spirit of Muslim search for identity, and he gave a political option or a political way to deal with the situation and how that solution fitted well with his notion and concept of Ummah. ALLAMA IQBAL was in a way offering a dream, a vision of future that materialized after his death. Let's take up the first section, that is background to ALLAMA IQBAL'S presidential address. Hindu-Muslim question was crucial to the history of British India. Hindu-Muslim question meant what would be the relationship between the two major communities, the Muslims and the Hindus, in the political and constitutional domains. What would be the rights provided to the Muslims, and what are going to be the safeguards and guarantees for those rights? That was the Hindu-Muslim question that acquired salience in the 20th century, and this became a kind of a central question which the Muslims were dealing with. The Congress perspective was that this issue of Hindu-Muslim relationship is the product of divide and rule policy. The British have consciously created splits and divisions. Therefore, it is an artificial issue which should not be emphasized. For Muslim, it was the core issue. It was the central issue. It related to their culture, their civilization, their heritage, and the type of arrangement that were to be done in the future political and constitutional arrangements of India. Therefore, Muslims were talking in terms of two nations, not in terms of communities. There are two nations with distinct identity, nations with their own interests and their rights. So this was the basic difference that had developed between the Muslims and the other community at that time when Iqbal gave this address. During that time, three major issues were of concern to the Muslim community. The first was the decline and degeneration of the Muslims. There was time when the Muslims were at the height of their power. They were ruling large sections of the world. They were making great contribution to knowledge, to science and technology. But this phase ended and started the period of decline and degeneration, and most of the Muslim states became the colony of European states. Then the Industrial Revolution, development of science and technology became a preserve of the European nations. So the question for Muslims was that why that degeneration and decline has set in amongst the Muslims. The people who were very important in the history of the world at one time were no longer important. The pivot of the international system has shifted to Europe. So this was one important issue that concerned the Muslims. The second issue was how to work for regeneration and revival of Muslims in general. How could Muslims overcome the decline and again assume their rightful place in the international system? The third issue was specific to the Muslims of South Asia. Muslims of South Asia shared the problems of Muslims as a whole, problem of decline, problem of degeneration. But in addition to this, there were certain specific problems which pertained to British India. One important problem which they faced here was that Muslims were a minority here. The majority was not Muslim. And this makes the situation in British India different from the situation in the Middle Eastern countries. In the Middle Eastern countries, Muslims were in majority. They did not have the fear or threat of being overwhelmed by an unsympathetic majority. In British India, the problem was that they could be overwhelmed by the other community. Therefore, they were emphasizing their identity, their value, their culture, and also heritage and civilization, which they thought and emphasized time and again that it gave them a different, a distinct, and exclusive identity. They were not simply a minority, but a community and a nation. The reason was that they did not want to be absorbed into the majority community. If you have a situation of minority and majority, and if majority gets absorbed into the majority, then this is one way that problem is solved. But the Muslims of British India, of the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent, were conscious of their heritage, were conscious of their historical importance, and they were defining their identity with reference to these characteristics and attributes. And they wanted that there have to be certain political arrangements, certain constitutional arrangement, whereby their identity is protected and they live with others within certain constitutional framework which assures them their rights and interests which are important to them. By 1930, this sentiment had developed very clearly, which was very much demonstrated in the development of history of India, or the question of relationship between the Muslims and the other community. It was in this context that Allama Iqbal delivered his presidential address. Allama Iqbal's political thought developed in three major phases. The first phase pertains to the pre-1905 period. In this period, he was talking about the factors for the decline of the Muslims, and his focus was on Indian nationality, Indian nationhood, or Indian unity. He was talking about resolving differences. This type of poetry is to be found in his book Bange Dara. He writes Tarana Hindi, Naya Shawala, where he talks of doing away with differences. The second phase pertains to period from 1905 to 1908. During these 3 years, he was in Europe, basically in England, where he was getting higher education, and also in Germany, from where he got his doctorate from Munich University. His stay in Europe, mainly in England, helped to crystallize his views and ideas, the views and ideas he was already developing. Iqbal appreciated certain things in the West. For example, quest for knowledge, their efforts for innovation and change. However, he was critical of materialism, capitalism, and competition, and unrestricted and unlimited competition that was undermining the society. And it is during this period that he began to think philosophically and scientifically about the Muslims. And he emphasized spiritualness, or the importance of spiritualness in one's life. The third phase starts when he comes back to India after spending time, after getting degrees from England and Germany. He comes back to India and examines the situation. Here his exclusive attention is focused on the Muslims. He talks about the centrality of Islam, question of submission to God, oneness of God, he emphasizes in his writings, prose as well as poetry. And he talks about the Holy Prophet as the ideal leader, as the leader that the Muslims should try to follow. To him, return to principles and ideals of Islam assures the Muslim that they can recover from their decline. And Islam offers them their salvation. Islam assures them that they can again become a force to reckon with. So the greater identification with the spirit of Islam was to him one way, an important way, to deal with the kind of problems Muslims were facing, not only in Indo-Pakistan subcontinent, but Muslims elsewhere. However, his focus was primarily Muslims of this subcontinent when he dealt with the political issues or the constitutional issues of India. Iqbal got the title of Sir in 1922 in recognition of his intellectual work. In 1927, Iqbal was elected to the Punjab Legislative Council. So for next little over 2 years, he served in the Punjab Legislative Council, that is from 1927 to 1930, little over 2 years. In 1930, he delivered the presidential address, the Allahabad address that we are going to discuss. But before this address, he also delivered landmark lectures on Islam in 1928 and 29 in Aligarh, Hyderabad, and Madras. These lectures are available in published form. In fact, these lectures provide a comprehensive view on Islam. These lectures are published under the title of Religious Reconstruction in Islam, although they were published in 1930 for the first time. But these lectures are still available because they are published time and again, and they are available in libraries. And if you want to do a detailed study of Iqbal's views on Islam and how could you deal with the modern conditions and modern situation, then these lectures would help you to do that. Then after that comes the Allahabad address that we will be discussing in some detail shortly. In 1932, he also presided over All India Muslim Conference that was held at Lahore. And during that conference, he repeated some of the ideas, some of the thoughts which he had presented in the 1930 address. Now we move on to the second section, that is his Allahabad address or presidential address at the Muslim League session, which was held on December 29th and December 30th, 1930. It's a detailed survey of the conditions of Muslims, the problems of Muslims in this subcontinent, and also role Islam can play in their lives. And then he goes on to suggest the solution of the problem of the Muslims. He talks about the importance of Islam in the lives of the Muslims as a whole and Muslims of this subcontinent. That Islam has a central place in his worldview, in his thinking, and that shapes his outlook, his choices, and his preferences. Islam, to him, serves as a kind of a framework for the Muslims. It offers an ethical order, a socio-political structure, a legal framework, code of life, culture, and civilization. This is a very comprehensive view of Islam in the lives of Muslims. And Iqbal rejects the European notion of duality in human life, that is, the state and religion. He does not accept the Western contention that state and religion, society and religion, are two entirely different things. He rejects the Western notion that religion, and in this case he is talking of Islam, that religion is only and totally an individual's personal concern. He emphasizes that in case of Islam, this kind of division is not possible because Islam is a code of conduct, is a comprehensive set of principles. It offers you guidance for all avenues of life, personal and public. Islam is a living and dynamic force, a force that can put all Muslims together, that is, the scattered community can be turned into a force. And Islam has the capability to address the modern issues and modern questions. On that basis, Iqbal argued that ideal of a united nation in India is unthinkable. That you think, as the Congress was thinking, that in India there is one nation, and that is the Indian nation, and other differences are not relevant and are not important. Iqbal was arguing in his 1930 address that this kind of notion is an unrealistic notion. This notion of a united nation in India does not reflect the ground realities, the reality and the truth as it exists in India because people, that is the Muslims, assign greater importance to their distinct identity and culture, and they are not willing to be absorbed into the majority community. They would like to maintain their cultural separateness or cultural individuality. Another problem in view of Iqbal was that there is a lack of trust, lack of confidence, and lack of understanding on how to deal with each other. So in a diversified society, when you have these kinds of developments and situation where there is lack of trust, lack of confidence, and one community is conscious of its identity and wants to preserve its identity, then you can't talk of one nation in India. For him, Muslims are a separate identity with separate interests. After suggesting these things, Iqbal then addresses the Muslims, and he emphasizes that the Muslims should devote themselves to Islam, because greater the contact they have with the spirit of Islam, the better it is for them and their future. Because it is this that has made them into a political identity. Therefore, they will have to go back to its spirit, and Muslims have to identify with its true spirit. That is how he thought Muslims can deal with their problems. Then going back to the Indian question or the Hindu-Muslim question, he said that federalism cannot work unless it takes into account the ground realities, the distinctive character, the distinctive concern, and also the anxieties which the Muslims have in this subcontinent. Therefore, he was arguing that the Muslims can deal with the situation if they recognize these realities. And that reality is that they will have to talk about the redistribution of territories. That is what he is emphasizing. That in order to solve the problems of this subcontinent, there is a need of redistribution of territories in British India. After making this argument, that is, redistribution of British India and not federation, he emphasizes that Punjab, NWFP, that is frontier province, Balochistan, and Sindh should be amalgamated into a political entity within British Empire or without. That is, that these areas should be created into a consolidated northwestern Muslim state, which would be within the British Empire or without. And to him, this political entity, through redistribution of territory, was to be the destiny of the Muslims, at least of northwestern India. In other words, he was talking about the establishment of a territorial unit by redistribution of territory, a territorial unit where Muslims would be in a majority. In all the 4 provinces Iqbal referred to, Muslims were in a majority. And he thought that if they are turned into a consolidated Muslim state, then this would serve the interests of the Muslims as well as India. Such a state would provide benefits to India. This will offer peace and security due to internal balance of power, that is, balance of power between the Muslims and the other community. They will have their own territorial unit, and others will have their own territorial unit. So it would provide a kind of balance of power. To the Muslims, such a unit provides an opportunity for greater contact with the spirit of Islam, and such a unit would also contribute to their role as part of the Ummah. He thought that this kind of a solution will provide them an arrangement that will benefit Muslims, because they will have their own political arrangements. They will have a redistributed territory where they could lead their lives in a manner that they have more effective contact with the spirit of Islam. For Iqbal, Islam was a people-building force, a force that consolidated Muslims, the people of this subcontinent. And he also was convinced that in difficult times and in difficult situations, it is Islam that comes to the salvation of the Muslims. He firmly believed that given the conditions that existed at that time, the ideas he presented, that is, redistribution of territories and establishment of a Muslim territorial unit within British India or British Empire or outside of British Empire, offered a kind of a satisfactory solution, a solution that will facilitate the resolution of the Hindu-Muslim question, the question of the type of relationship Muslims and the others should have, and it offered them guarantees, assurances, commitments to protect their identity, their heritage, and their civilization. This was, in very brief, what he said in his Allahabad address. It's a detailed address. If you like, you can read its text. The text is available in the books on Pakistan movement. But what we have done here is to give you the main points, the basic idea which he had tried to present. To repeat, his basic ideas can be summed up in 2 or 3 sentences. First, he thinks that Islam plays a central and vital role in the lives of the Muslims, and their salvation lies in identification with the spirit of Islam. Second, Muslims cannot be absorbed into the majority community. They cannot be viewed as simply a minority, but they have rights and interests. Third, on that basis, he talks about redistribution of territories, and he talks about the amalgamation of Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, and Northwest Frontier Province as a kind of solution for the Muslims living in northwestern parts of India. Now let's talk about the fourth part of today's lecture, that is importance. We have talked about the background, we have talked about the content and the main points of his lecture. Now, what is the significance of Allama Iqbal's lecture in the history of British India or Indo-Pakistan subcontinent? His Allahabad presidential address is a very forceful and logical presentation of Muslim case. Issues that Muslims are a separate entity, they are a separate nation, were being raised. But now, in his presidential address, he cites historical evidence from India to substantiate his case. He talks about what had been happening in the subcontinent for the last 25 years, going back to the establishment of the Muslim League in 1906. Then he talks about the period of 1916 and in the 20s, and he said that such a proposal was presented at different level in the past. To the Simon Commission, this was presented, which was not heeded to by the British. So, in a way, this was a very forceful and logical presentation, logical in the sense that if you look at the historical development in India, starting from 1857, particularly from the beginning of the 20th century, 1906, and if you move from 1906 to 1930, when Iqbal delivered this lecture, you will have enough empirical evidence, concrete evidence, and historical developments to support what Iqbal was saying in his lecture. The most significant thing in his presentation is the answer which he gives to a question that is, why should Muslims be treated as a separate entity rather than a minority? The difference between a minority and a distinct political entity and a nation is very significant. When you are talking of political rights, political interests, and constitutional arrangements. And at that time, the issue of new constitutional arrangement was being discussed by the British government. So it was very significant that he presented a case for the distinct and separate entity of the Muslims in this subcontinent. On the basis of that advocacy, he talks about the rights and interests of the Muslims. If you remove this advocacy, then his proposal, the political formula which he gives, does not hold ground. That holds ground if you examine his arguments. Then I think we can look at this lecture from a related but different aspect, that is the importance of Hindu-Muslim question in Indian history. And his lecture clearly shows that that is an important issue, and he tries to find a response, a formula to solve that question. Another way to look at this lecture is when you try to understand how he was defining the Muslim identity with reference to Islam. His lecture that we are discussing and even other writings emphasize that Islam plays an important role in Muslim identity formation in British India. When we talk of a distinct Muslim identity, for Iqbal, Islam was central to that. Islam was holding key to that. And as I have mentioned when I was discussing the content of his lecture, he was saying that Islam is a people building force, a force that really transformed Muslims from scattered groups, from diversified groups, from people living in different parts of India into a cohesive, united community with a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a desire to assert their identity, and desire to be recognized in the constitutional and political arrangements which were to be introduced in India by the British. And you can also talk about the redistribution which he suggested. He was talking about the redistribution of territory in northwest, or what is today's Pakistan. If you read ALLAMA IQBAL'S letters, which he wrote to Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah from May 1936 to November 1937, during this period, he wrote several letters to Jinnah, and those letters have been published. They are available in published form, and if you wish, you can read those letters. In those letters, Iqbal articulates the views that he has presented in his Allahabad address. In fact, he elaborates on those issues. You would recall that when he was talking of redistribution of territory, he was focusing on Northwest. In his letters to Jinnah, he also talks about Bengal, that area, and he argues, why can't the Muslims of Northwest and Bengal be considered entitled to self-determination like any other nation? In his letter, he also emphasizes that a state is needed to implement Sharia. To him, that implementation is not possible unless Muslims have their own state, their own territory in which they can implement the Sharia. Then the last important issue that he raised, and which outlines and identifies the importance, is the advice which he gives to Muslims. Minded, this advice was given in 1930, and that advice given to Muslims in 1930 is valid and relevant even today. His advice was that they should rise above their differences and devote themselves to Islam. And this message, rise above your differences, rise above your self-interest, and devote yourself to Islam, identify yourself with spirit of Islam, is valid today. We need this advice even today. Iqbal also emphasizes about role of faith, culture, civilization in one's life. To him, these are more important than territory or territorial units, because they are the basis of identity and culture. This concludes our discussion of Allama Iqbal's presidential address. Khuda Hafiz, until we meet again. Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 9 of Pakistan Studies. The topic is Muslim Politics and Chaudhary Rehmat Ali. Chaudhary Rehmat Ali made a significant contribution to the movement for the establishment of Pakistan. He was conscious of the Muslim identity and proposed the partition of India for protection of Muslims. Chaudhary Rehmat Ali coined the word Pakistan in 1933 in his writings. When he presented his proposal for creating a Muslim state called Pakistan, nobody took it seriously. Some of the leaders, including the Muslim leaders, described this as a student's